The living legend Charlton Heston reminds us of his early Christmas.
Almost 100 years ago, the editor of the New York Sun got a letter from a little girl. She wrote, "Dear editor, I'm 8 years old. Some of my friends say there is no Santa Claus. Papa says if you see it in the sun, it's so. Please tell me the truth. Is there a Santa Claus?" The editor's answer was printed on the front page of his paper. It's been reprinted tens of thousands of times since. This is what he wrote. "Dear Virginia, your little friends are wrong. They've been affected by the skepticism of a skeptical age. They believe only what they see. They think that nothing can be which their own little minds can't comprehend. Virginia, in this great universe of ours, all minds are little. Man's a mere insect, an ant in his intellect, as compared with the boundless world about him. Virginia, Santa Claus exists as certainly as love and generosity and devotion exist. You know that they abound and give your life beauty and joy. Alas, how dreary this world would be if there were no Virginias. There would be no childlike faith then, no poetry, no romance to make this existence tolerable. We'd have no enjoyment except in sense and sight. The eternal light with which childhood fills the world would be extinguished. Not believe in Santa Claus? You might as well not believe in fairies. You might get your papa to watch the chimneys on Christmas Eve to catch Santa Claus, but even if he didn't see him coming down, what would that prove? Nobody sees Santa Claus. That means nothing. The most real things in the world are those that neither children nor men can see. Did you ever see fairies dancing on the lawn? Of course not. That doesn't prove they're not there. Nobody can conceive or imagine all the wonders unseen and unseeable in the world. There's a veil covering the unseen world which not the strongest man that ever lived could tear apart. Only faith, poetry, love, romance can push that curtain aside and reveal the supernatural beauties and glory beyond. Is it real? Ah, Virginia, in all this world, there's nothing else so real and abiding. No Santa Claus. Thank God he lives and lives forever. 1,000 years from now, he will still make glad the heart of childhood. Oh yes, Virginia, there is a Santa Claus. Merry Christmas to you.
That was a real one. Thank you both. God bless you.
Thank you.
First thing to deal with is, what is an argument? The popular idea is two people fighting with each other. Okay, that's not what we're talking about here. That's not the kind of argument that we want to deal with. The argument that we're talking about is a claim or a conclusion based on reasons. So having a point of view, but also having reasons to support that point of view. That is an argument. Now, bad arguments usually come in two forms. One is an assertion with no reasons, just a point of view, declaring a point of view, such as, the Bible is just a bunch of myths. Okay, well, that's a point of view. Tell me why you think that. I'm curious. Okay, so then you're asking somebody to give you an argument. The second reason something could be a bad argument is that reasons are given, but they don't actually support the claim. So I thought a classic example was from the 1960s. Nikita Khrushchev, of course, the head of the Soviet Union at that time, declared that he had a good argument for why God didn't exist. And that is because Yuri Gagarin, the first cosmonaut to go into orbit, looked around and he didn't see anybody up there. Now, what's wrong with that argument? Anybody?
Supposes God lives outside the atmosphere.
Okay, it presupposes that there's somebody up there that you can see. if God exists. And of course, maybe he just wasn't looking in the right place. I mean, space is pretty big. So these are examples of bad arguments, and we're going to examine a lot of arguments that you may have heard or even thought, believed yourself, but that turn out to be not good for various reasons. And in some cases, I'll try to identify the name of the fallacy. So you'll get a little training in critical thinking here and informal fallacies as we go on. Now here's a quote from a gentleman that I get a lot of material from, Greg Kokel of Stand to Reason. He says, Christianity can be defended if it is properly understood and properly articulated. Christianity can be defended if it is properly understood and properly articulated. And that's one of the reasons why we have this January class, is because we don't often address specifically how to understand and articulate Christianity. But does it even make sense to defend religious beliefs? A lot of people don't think so. In a lot of people's minds, religion is just a personal, private experience. You have your experience, I have my experience. You can't really defend an experience. You just report it. Is that what we're talking about? Is that religion that we're talking about here? Or is religion a useful myth? And that's why I played that Charlton Heston clip at the beginning. Because this actually, the analogy of Santa Claus to God is very strong. And you see this not only in this editorial, but also in movies like Miracle on 34th Street, the new version, and others, where belief in Santa Claus is applauded for children. You got to have it, but everybody kind of knows that you're talking about something that's a fantasy. But it's useful. We like the idea of Santa Claus. And so he says, not believe in Santa Claus, you might as well not believe in fairies. Well, okay. I don't think that he was answering Virginia's question. Virginia, when she asked the question, is there a Santa Claus, she wanted to know if there is a fat guy at the North Pole that she can see and touch and that flies around the world on Christmas Eve. She wanted to know that. They didn't answer her question. This guy, this editorial writer, answered in a way that pleased adults because it kind of reinforced this mythology and warm feelings and childhood that, will believe in myths and fairies. But it didn't answer her question. I'm very sympathetic to her. And so as I was looking around on the web, I saw an objection by Reverend Keith Wright, who wrote, "No, Virginia, there is no Santa Claus." And he said, "Use your reason, Virginia. As impossible as the fables of Genesis, the New Testament, and the Easter Bunny are, so is the mythical Santa Claus." Now here's a reverend who is obviously making the connection, the parallel between Santa Claus and belief in God. He's very clear, and he thinks it's actually immoral for the church to teach these things that everybody knows are clearly made up. Is that what we mean by religion? You'll see that no, it isn't. Some people say that religious faith is actually undermined by faith and reason. That if you have evidence, that you can't have faith. This is a widespread belief in the church, that if you have some kind of evidence or good reasons for believing in Jesus, that somehow means you can't have faith in him or don't have faith in him. Okay, all this is wrong. This is Steve talking now. All this is a wrong way to look at it. I like what Stephen Meyer says, the president of the Discovery Institute up in Seattle. He says, the heart cannot exult in what the mind rejects. Once a child gets of a certain age, maybe it's 10, maybe it's 8, maybe it's 3, they start trying to make sense of the world and believe what we tell them about the Bible, about Jesus, about Christianity. If we're telling them stuff that we don't have good reasons for, if we're just saying, you know, this doesn't make sense, but you just got to believe it, eventually there comes a point at which I think a person just naturally says, well, I'll put my religious belief over here in this box, and I'll put the real world over here in this box. The two are separate from each other. And that's the way a lot of Christians live today, with their belief in God box and their real world box. That isn't the world that Jesus talked about. Jesus' world was combined. The real world was his world and his description of reality and what God was like. So if we want to follow in Jesus' footsteps, we can't have two separate boxes. They're one box. That's why we have the ability, and actually I think the responsibility, to look for reasons for our faith. Now, Christianity is uniquely suited for this because it claims to be historical and rational. Here's a couple of verses. There's many, many more. Paul says, test everything. He also says, I think before Festus, what I am saying is true and reasonable, as he recounted his testimony and his claims about Jesus. In 1 Corinthians 15, he says, if Christ has not been raised physically from the dead, your faith is futile. It's nice sounding platitudes do no good whatsoever in Christianity. If we count on certain historical events having actually taken place. What this means is that Christianity can be falsified. Let that sink in. Christianity can be falsified. That's not like other religions, where, you know, the mystical, Buddhism, the sound of one hand clapping. I mean, it may comfort you somehow, but it's not falsifiable. Sayings of gurus, no, disconnected from evidence. Blind faith and authority, that's not what we're talking about here. You know, Islam might do that. Just check out your mind and just follow obediently and submit. That's not Christianity. That's not what Jesus taught. Persisting in spite of negative evidence. Mormonism comes to mind here, where we actually have evidence that Joseph Smith was wrong, or that mistranslated documents that he claimed to have translated from Egyptian. I mean, we have the documentation right in front of us. Doesn't matter. For Christians, it does matter. So, since Christianity is dependent on evidence and reason, we should see it in the scriptures, and that's what we do. So here's a few examples of how important evidence and reason are to biblical Christians. In Exodus, God offered signs and wonders. Why? So that people would know and believe. John 14, Jesus says, don't just take my word for it, I'm paraphrasing here. He says, believe on account of the miracles that I did. Here's some evidence. John 20, the Apostle John, who wrote the Gospel, says, these accounts, everything that had gone before, are written to you that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ. All of this is evidence for you. In 1 John 1:3, he says, we proclaim to you what we have seen and heard, and our hands have touched. He's not just talking about good ideas. He's talking about real events that he experienced and saw and other people did also. He's inviting them to verify it. Okay, so you want to know how to destroy Christianity? A lot of people do. Well, it's very easy to destroy Christianity. Christian claims are vulnerable. They're vulnerable to factual challenges and logical challenges. That's what I'm saying. Christianity is vulnerable. If it can't withstand factual challenges and logical challenges, it doesn't have a leg to stand on. So, for instance, we in this church are sunk, and we ought to just close the doors if there is no God. Okay? Kind of seems obvious. But to a lot of people, it isn't that obvious. There are a lot of Christian churches actually meeting this morning in which many of the people believe there is no God. That the Reverend, whatever his name is, an example of one of those. We're sunk if there's no soul, if there's no immaterial part of human beings, if we're all just physical stuff, and there is no me that survives the death of my body, Christianity is sunk. It's false. If the Jesus of the New Testament never existed, if he was actually just some guru that got inflated centuries later, no good. If Jesus didn't physically rise from the dead, we're told our faith is futile. If the Christian claims are logically self-contradictory, if it's not rational, if the Christian claims are logically self-contradictory, then Christianity is false, and you ought to go someplace else. So that's what we're up against here, and we're going to see a number of people attempting to do this, destroy Christianity by employing one of these challenges, types of challenges, either a factual claim or a logical.